And we're continuing our look at the 1920s. I'm going to begin, though, by talking about this concept of revolution. So a revolution are big changes in society, big changes that are economic in nature, political, and social. It really needs to be a revolution, needs to have changes in all three of these domains. And there are two main responses to these big changes. There's conservative, what worked in the past, is what is needed. And the problem is not with the system, but rather it is with individuals within the system. And the other side of that would be progressive, where new ideas are needed to solve problems, and the problem is systemic. Parts of the system need to be corrected. Well, let's go back in time a little bit. So we looked at industrialization, 1870 to 1910, and the response to these changes that industrialization brought about. The 40 years of industrialization brought lots of changes and, frankly, lots of problems, and the response to that was progressivism. And then came World War I, 1914 and 1918, and that similarly was a revolution of sorts and brought about big changes. And the response to these changes was to be conservative, or Warren G. Harding's return to normalcy, which technically is not a word, that he should have said return to normality, not normalcy. But we'll let that go. And that's the time period we're in right now. So the 1920s was a conservative time, and that conservative response takes many forms in the 1920s, from nativism to the rise of the Ku Klux Klan to Prohibition and religious fundamentalism. These are the various conservative responses to some of the changes being felt after World War I. So let's dig a little deeper into this. I want to remind you that nativism is hostility toward immigrants, and that's going to kind of weave its way through a lot of this. Remember that immigration had reached its high point at about 1910, but then with World War I really stopped, and through legislation became a permanent end during the 1920s. And interestingly enough, in this idea that life imitates art, I want to talk for a moment about this movie called The Birth of a Nation, made in 1915, and it glorified the Klan after the Civil War. You know, one thing, I don't know if you know about history, but what's taught in history, what is considered to be historically accurate, changes over time. And that's not because the facts change, but the way the facts are interpreted change. And by the early 1900s, the Civil War, rather than blaming the South, which was typical right after the Civil War, the South seemed to be more as victims, were seen as victims in historical writings. And there was an element of the Klan right after the Civil War, but that kind of faded away. But in 1915, a movie about the time period after the Civil War and during Reconstruction, they glorified the Klan. And many of the Klan symbols that are still used today, the hooded costumes they wear and the burning crosses, came from the film. This isn't what the Klan had done after the Civil War. This was a Hollywood creation because the D.W. Griffith, the director of the movie, thought it would make interesting viewing. Well, inspired by this film, William Joseph Simmons, who lived outside of Atlanta, Georgia, with 15 other members, began or restarted the Ku Klux Klan. And it was growth based on anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic, anti-Semitic, which means anti-Jewish, prohibitionist, in addition to a racist agenda. So they weren't just anti-African American, they had lots of different people they were against, be they immigrant and Catholic and Jewish, and they were against the consumption of alcohol. These were elements of this new Klan, which began in the second decade of the 1900s. The Klan was most active in the South and Midwest, especially in Indiana and Michigan, and the West, especially in Colorado and Oregon, and was most active in fast-growing cities like Detroit and Memphis and Dayton and Atlanta, Dallas and Houston. Now, at the same time of this Klan, there was this radical element of immigrants living in the United States, and one of these was Luigi Gagliani, who published in his writing *The Propaganda of the Deed*, where he advocated the use of violence to eliminate tyrants and oppressors and to act as a spark to overthrow the government. He actively wanted to do that in the United States. June 2nd, 1919, 8 cities and 8 bombs go off simultaneously. In Washington, D.C., the House of the Attorney General, pictured here, was targeted, and in the explosion, the bomber was killed, who happened to be an Italian immigrant. It didn't do a terrible amount of damage to the house, and the detonator of the bomb, Attorney General Palmer's home, and like I said, the only victim was the bomber himself. I showed you this. I want to show you. Look at this picture of Wall Street, 23 Wall Street in New York City, the office of J.P. Morgan and Company. This is what it looks like today. And this was the scene on September 16, 1920, when a wagon load of explosives and lead weights was detonated at that spot, and in order to cause some of this terrorist activity advocated by some radical groups in the early 1920s. It was a horse-drawn wagon with 100 pounds of dynamite and 50 pounds of cast iron sash weights. A sash weight would be used to open and close windows. They're long cast iron weights. 38 people were killed, and most of them were young people, messengers, stenographers, and clerks and brokers who worked in and on Wall Street. They were just young people, like in the early 20s. These actions, so you combine the work of the Klan and these radical groups, oftentimes led by newer immigrants, helped bring about the Immigration Restriction Act of 1924, where the annual immigration to the country would be limited to 2% of the number of people from that country living in the U.S. in 1890. Well, the year 1890 was really important because most of the immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, like Italian, came after 1890. So 2% of it was a very small number when the original population was very small. For all intents and purposes, this law eliminated immigration to the United States. At the same time, another response to another nativist response was Prohibition, which was a nationwide constitutional ban on the sale, production, importation, and transportation of alcohol beverages from 1920 to 1933. But this actually wasn't it was as much about anti-immigrant as it was anti-alcohol. The history of Prohibition starts with the Anti-Saloon League, where this was an organization in the late 1800s that pressured politicians and elected candidates who supported Prohibition. It was very effective at getting political candidates elected or defeated. It was a very strong advocacy group, kind of a single issue advocacy group, and they were against saloons. Well, saloons were popular social gathering places for industrial workers, especially immigrant workers. It was the place where they would go. It was like a social club. They'd go after work. This was a place where immigrants would go and hang out in big cities. And they were financed by brewers like this man, Frederick Pabst, who his company still brews beer today. It became important places for politicians. They would go hang out in saloons, and they would encourage and help get the vote of these immigrant men to vote for them. And this was a very much concern for the people who lived in the United States and were more native-born people living in the United States. It was seen as being a not good place. The Prohibition was in many ways about anti-urbanization. People feared the growth and spread of cities with its increase in crime and violence. Anti-immigrant. People feared that millions of new people coming to America, they didn't know they didn't understand these people, and they made them nervous and they scared them. Anti-industrialization. People feared the growth of industrial power. Thinking about all these problems we've looked at in industrialization, that that progressivism tried to fix, but then the fears came back with World War I. The saloon for prohibitionists became the symbol for what was wrong in America. Alcohol was consumed there. It was seen as being an evil place. And believe it or not, the 16th Amendment, which was really a federal income tax, was played into Prohibition because it replaced alcohol taxes as a major source of funding for the federal government. And the 19th Amendment played into this because women gained the right to vote and women tended to support Prohibition, in large part because so many women suffered so much abuse from alcoholic husbands. World War I played into Prohibition. A ban on the production of alcohol would allow more resources, especially grain, to go to the war effort. So feeding livestock rather than making whiskey. So the Constitutional Amendment on January 1919, 36 of the 48 states ratified the proposed amendment, making it part of the Constitution. And that was the 18th Amendment. National prohibition went into effect on January of 1920. Now, that's related to the Volstead Act, which Congress passed this law to enforce prohibition. So the amendment banned alcohol, but the Volstead Act was the actual law that went into effect to enforce this, and there's named after Andrew Volstead, a congressman from Minnesota. It went into effect in the next year. Now, it's important when we talk about prohibition to talk about some of the exceptions to prohibition. There were medical exceptions. From 1921 to 1930, doctors earned $40 million during that time period in 1920 dollars for whiskey prescriptions. And if you look at this label carefully, this was bottled expressly for medicinal use. This whiskey was if you had a medical reason for whiskey. This should sound somewhat like medicinal use of marijuana, for example, that is allowed in most states, even in states where marijuana is not legal. There were religious exceptions for prohibition. Sacramental wine for religious ceremonies was permitted. You see this guy carrying out 2 containers of wine for allegedly a religious purpose. Nationwide, during Prohibition, the consumption of wine increased by 100% during Prohibition. One might think that people became more religious during that time, but that isn't necessarily the case. There were homemade exceptions to Prohibition. It allowed individuals to produce wine and hard cider at home for individual consumption, and this was to benefit farmers and orchard growers. And there was industrial exceptions to Prohibition. Alcohol could be produced for a variety of industrial uses. There's also problems with the enforcement of the 18th Amendment. It lacked legitimacy in the eyes of the majority of the people in America. Even though they may have supported politicians who supported it, they still wanted to drink, and they would still smuggle in alcohol. There was also the problem with enforcement because the U.S. Department of Justice, the Bureau of Prohibition, was woefully underfunded. There wasn't money to enforce all of this. Courts were overwhelmed with alcohol possession of arrests. It's some of the same problem we have with some of our drug laws today, where our courts get overwhelmed with drug cases. Distilleries in Canada and Mexico and the Caribbean produce huge quantities of alcohol to ship to the United States. If you look at this picture, across the river, this is in Detroit, Michigan, so the separation between Canada and the United States at Detroit is by this relatively narrow river. You can see a lookout here laying here with glasses awaiting a signal with a loaded speedboat there with alcohol, and there'd be someone on the other side waiting to have this alcohol delivered. The Reverend Billy Sunday said, "The reign of tears is over. The slums will soon be memory. We will turn our prisons into factories and our jails into storehouses and corn cribs. Men will walk upright now. Women will smile and children will laugh. Hell will be forever rent." This is what he said at the beginning of Prohibition, like it was going to solve all of our nation's troubles. At the other side of the spectrum is Al Capone, a gangster, a murderer, and an alcohol provider. All I do is to supply a public demand. Somebody had to throw some liquor on that thirst. Why not me? People supported Prohibition claimed it would reduce crime, solve social problems, reduce the tax burdens caused by the need for poorhouses and prisons, and make Americans healthier. That's what they claimed. In reality, though the rate of alcohol consumption initially decreased, it would later increase and become much more dangerous to consume. That's because it was made at home, and some of the alcohol, the potency was so strong, and some of the industrial alcohol, which was unsafe to drink, people consumed it anyway. This graph shows you the per capita, per person consumption of alcoholic beverages, gallons of pure alcohol, 1910 to 1929. If you look at the 1920s, the right half of the graph, after 1920, when there's quite a big dip, it increased and steadily grew throughout the 1920s. In reality, crime rates increased and organized crime began during the 1920s. During Prohibition, both street gangs and the mafia make their first appearance in American cities, supplying alcohol. In reality, courts and prison systems were stretched to the breaking point, eventually requiring an expansion of both. The homicide rate climbed steadily during the 1920s, as shown at the middle bars of this graph. By 1932, the total number of convicts in federal prisons had increased by 561% from 1920, and government spending on prisons increased by 1,000%. In reality, corruption of public officials became widespread. No measurable gains were made in productivity or absenteeism because of the banning of alcohol. Prohibition removed a significant source of tax revenue and required a significant increase of government spending and made the government go into debt. Many drinkers switched to opium, marijuana, cocaine, and other dangerous substances they would have been unlikely to encounter in the absence of Prohibition. Here's an opium den in New York City in 1925. And finally, the 21st Amendment in 1933 ended Prohibition. Other responses to these cultural changes during this time period was the Scopes trial. This was when a substitute high school science teacher, John Scopes, accused of violating Tennessee's Butler Act. Butler Act made it illegal to teach evolution in any state-funded school. Illegal to teach anything about the concept of evolution. The trial was deliberately staged in order to draw attention to the Butler Act, and the two attorneys was William Jennings Bryant, prosecuting Scopes, and Clarence Darrow, his defense attorney. The trial drew publicity to the fundamentalist modernist controversy. And the fundamentalist position was that the Word of God as revealed in the Bible took priority over all human knowledge, and the modernist position was evolution was not inconsistent with religion. And so these were the two sides. But remember, this conservative response was a response to some of the changes that were felt really brought to a head by World War I. And in the aftermath of World War I. And a conservative position is that it isn't our system that needs changed, it's people acting within the system. The Scopes trial case was seen as a trial on whether modern science regarding the creation-evolution controversy should be taught in school. Scopes was found guilty and fined $100, a verdict that was overturned on a technicality. So, this one big part of the 1920s was this conservative response to some of these problems and issues brought about by World War I and its aftermath. And again, it helps to highlight the the difference between a conservative perspective and a more progressive perspective, which we looked at a couple of units ago. And that's your big show for today.